This is Frankie Lynch, Saturn Girl. Please, please, please like the video, subscribe to my channel, and also comment below because I want to know what you think and it helps out with the algorithm. So anyway, I'm doing this video today as an introduction to Western astrology. People have asked me a little bit about this sort of thing, and I thought it would be a good idea to do a video on this. So please bear with me because, this will be a little bit lengthy, but hopefully not too lengthy. I'm going to try and just blast through it. I've got a bunch of fun notes right here. Excuse me. So what is astrology? It's a system of divination, and it uses astronomical phenomena as its basis for interpretation. So the movement of things in the sky, astronomical phenomena. So that means astrologers look at the motion of celestial objects and mathematical points, and you'll see what I mean in a little bit, as symbolizing events, people, places, things, and even qualities. So we'll talk a little bit about the history here. If you want to know more about the history of Western astrology and astrology in general, I suggest checking out Chris Brennan, Demetra George, and even Dr. David Miano, who's an ancient historian and has a wonderful little series on some of the history of astrology. So anyway, astrology first emerged in ancient Mesopotamia around 2000 BCE, so like 4,000 years ago. It's often referred to as Babylonian astrology, but that's sort of misleading because ancient Mesopotamia, it was an ever-changing kaleidoscope of cultures that were vying for supremacy and power. We won't go into details, but it's really interesting history. They were united by common religions and languages. There was Sumerian, there was Akkadian. Astrology first appeared as omens, and we see them recorded on clay tablets, right? So they used to take clay and indent in them with, say, a reed or a stylus of some kind. And then they would let them dry in the sun. The language that they had on there we call cuneiform, or at least the script. The languages themselves were Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, etc., etc., etc. So these omens would take basic phenomena like, say, an eclipse, and it would correlate to a type of event. So like the death of a king. If X, then Y. These sort of omens, you see? So it's sort of interesting because there was an ancient Akkadian tablet, I believe it was Assyrian, called the Diviner's Manual. And I'm going to read you a little translation here of what it says. It says, signs on the earth, just as those in the sky, give us signals. Sky and earth both produce portents though appearing separately. So portents are again like omens, or, they are not separate because sky and earth are interconnected. A sign that portends evil in the sky is also evil in the earth. One that portends evil on earth is evil in the sky. And we'll break that down when we get to the end of this whole thing. But it's very interesting that you see the philosophy behind it. It says signs in the sky, signs in the sky and earth both produce portents, though appearing separately. So they're basically saying that events that happen in the sky or in the heavens indicate or correlate with events that happen on earth, and vice versa, because they're interconnected. So in fact, we have a tablet referred to as Mul-Apin from about around 1000 BCE. It's the first known star catalog. It's interesting because it's almost like a proto-ephemeris, except for it didn't have the predictions or the projections of the movements of planets out into the future. Rather, it had data going back however far. So this is quite interesting. Now, astrology itself, or at least this proto-astrology, which was mostly mundane, meaning having to do with, events with groups of people and nations, etc., macrocosmic sort of events. So around 700 to 600 BCE, the Neo-Assyrian Empire became one of the biggest patrons in the ancient world of astrology. And so Ashurbanipal, the last of the great Assyrian kings, established the Great Library at Nineveh, which was the greatest repository in its day of ancient knowledge and wisdom, including astrological data and astronomical data that was collected from all over Sumer and Akkad over hundreds of years. So, well, that library was destroyed, of course, in one of these warring events, but we won't go into all that. So, ancient Egyptian astrology, too. It wasn't just in ancient Mesopotamia. We have evidence of the ancient Egyptian culture tracking the movement of stars going back to about 2000 BCE. In fact, we have evidence of what's called the 36 Egyptian decans inscribed on sarcophagi as far back as 2100 BCE. We'll talk a little bit about the whole decans thing later. But they were really interested, or primarily interested, with the rising, or I guess I should do this hand, with the rising and culminating of objects, right, from east to west over the course of a day. And we'll see how that factors into a lot of the symbolism a little bit later. Now, the zodiac as we know it, and we'll talk a little bit about it later. The zodiac as we know it, meaning the 12 equal signs of 30 degrees, right? That first emerged around 450 BCE. And that was around the time of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which is quite interesting because that's around the time, too, when the Persians sacked the Neo-Babylonian Empire and toppled it. And that itself released the elite, or the aristocratic prisoners from Judea. Because just a little bit before that, King Nebuchadnezzar II had sacked Judea and taken, the elite Jews from, the aristocrats from the area of Judea, took them prisoner to which is called the Babylonian captivity, where the Babylonian Talmud was primarily written as well. So it's quite interesting that all these sort of events, correlated with each other. So now the Babylonian calendar itself was a solar lunar calendar, meaning that the month traced the movement of the moon in the lunar phases, whereas the year had to do with the solstices and equinoxes. So, excuse me, in fact, according to the famous Assyriologist, Francesca Rochberg, who all of us, astrologers sort of quote and look up to. In fact, her book, do I have it right here? Do I have it right here? I don't think I do have it right here. I don't want to waste time looking for it. Oh, here it is. Here it is. And you should all take a look at it. It's called The Heavenly Writing by Assyriologist Francesca Rochberg. I don't know if I'm saying her name correctly, but it's a very, very good book for those of you who are interested in the history of divination and of astrology. So anyway, which is divination? So I know that's history that you probably don't care about, but it's really interesting. So the reason why I mention the solstices and equinoxes is because the idea of tropical and sidereal astrology is sort of contentious these days. And we'll describe the difference between the two in a little bit. So anyway, After that came the Hellenistic period, which was around 323 BCE and, went to about 300 CE or so. So you see what happened was Alexander the Great, right? Alexander of Macedon conquered a huge swath of land, stretching from the Mediterranean all the way to the Indian subcontinent. He didn't conquer the Indian subcontinent, just the region going through Punjab, but he made it right there. And so what's quite interesting from all that was syncretism and cultural exchange. The whole Hellenistic world became sort of a cultural melting pot where ancient cultures were sharing ideas. And there was even religious syncretism going on. A big example is the whole idea of Thoth Hermes, right? The Egyptian god Thoth, who is the god of writing and the occult. Cat hair everywhere. Oh, goodness. Who was the god of writing and the occult, was conflated with Hermes, who also, the Greek god having to do with similar things to Thoth. So we saw this religious syncretism happen a lot. Now, Babylonian astrology came to Greece. There's a famous quote, I believe it's by Aristotle, that talks about about how adept the Babylonians are at using the stars to predict the future. Excuse me. So the Hellenistic astrology sort of seemed to appear in the record around the 1st century BCE. So it seemed like it just emerged as a complete system. Its origins are sort of shrouded in mystery in a way. I mean, we knew astrology came from Babylon, but how did it just emerge with all these, it's a system of symbolism. Where did this all come from? How did it come so mature like this? So very few sources survive from that time period. We do have authors we rely on, like Vidius Valens. There's Antiochus. We have the Hermetic texts, which are attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, which is probably the conflation, right, of Thoth and Hermes. Marcus Manilius, which is probably the oldest original text we have. A lot of the other ones are references to older texts, right, in later texts. But Marcus Manilius, Astronomica, I think it's the oldest source we have. Primary source, rather. The Hermetic tradition is a big source and a primary philosophical basis for astrology. But to my knowledge, we don't know where a lot of those original sources actually came from. So they're attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, which we talked about with religious syncretism. But you see, there was a habit back in those days of assigning authorship, if that's a word, to mythical figures or ancient figures that would be seen as authorities on things so that the text would be taken more seriously. These days it's like, I want to be known for that. I want to get credit, I sure do. Anyway, so this whole world, the Hellenistic world and astrology itself was centered in Alexandria, in Egypt, which is sort of interesting because ancient Egypt had a tradition of all this. The Hermetica itself, Hermetic philosophy, and this is according to Dr. Justin Slade. Check out his channel, Esoterica channel. Scholars are showing that there's a lot more Egyptian philosophy coursing through the Hermetic tradition than was traditionally given credit for. And that's quite interesting too. So it seems like even though there's some Greek philosophy that seems pervasive through the Hermetic tradition, it also seems to stretch back into Egyptian philosophy that predates all this. So what's quite interesting too is that astrology went to India. Now, there is evidence that astrology is older and goes back into antiquity in India. In fact, there's the Vedanga Jyotisha, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but that's the first known text that has anything to do with astrology, but it doesn't have anything to do necessarily with horoscopic astrology, which came later in the Indian tradition and probably came from the Greeks. The Vedanga Jyotisha dates back to about 700 to 600 BCE. And then the oldest, right, horoscopic astrological text in Sanskrit we have is called the Yavana Yadika, which dates back to around 300 to 500 CE, so AD. And its name literally means nativity according to the Greeks. So that's quite interesting. Like I said, there was a lot of syncretism and exchange of ideas going back and forth. So, Indian astrology is now known as Vedic astrology. And a lot of those ideas also came over, right? So exchange, cultural exchange. What's really important to note here is that astrology is correlative, not causal. Now, remember what the Diviner's Manual said earlier. It has to do with interrelation and interconnection. So, anyway, that brings us to the medieval period. So this is following the rise of Christendom and its violent oppression of pagan culture, anything that was seen as, not Christian. So astrologers were all chased off, right? They pretty much all left for the Middle East and for the Persian area. And so there came a rich tradition of astrology in the Arab world. So there are very famous medieval Arab astrologers like Abu Mashar, Ibn Ezra, and plenty of others. Eventually astrology made it back to medieval Italy, where we have characters like Guido Bonatti. And then later we have Placidus de Titus, I believe in the 1600s. So that was around the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. We also had William Lilly in England with Christian astrology. And then we slowly give way to the modern period. And so astrology gets big again, right after sort of being displaced by the scientific revolution as being sort of superstition. But it gets big again towards the end of the 19th century with the rise of what's called theosophy, the theosophical movement. That started with a pretty famous figure known as Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, who I studied for many years. She wrote a famous book called The Secret Doctrine, which basically it made the occult world again get enticing. It brought fame to the mysterious world of ancient philosophies and histories and ancient peoples. It professed to expound upon a doctrine or a knowledge or a wisdom that stretched back into ancient antiquity. You could sort of say it took for its own basis the ancient philosophies that were the underlying philosophical basis of ancient astrology. For example, Platonism, Stoicism, and Hermeticism. So Helena Blavatsky, or Madame Blavatsky, as she came to be known, started the Theosophical Society in 1875. It was essentially a spiritual movement that sought to unify the spiritual doctrines of the East and the West. And like I said, it became the basis of what we know as modern astrology. In fact, Alan Leo, who's considered the grandfather or the granddaddy, the father of modern astrology, he was a theosophist. He was a devotee of the theosophical teaching and of Madame Blavatsky. And he wrote the first books on modern astrology. He also was the first to give it the psychological spin. So it became the first pivot away from the divinatory or the material sort of presentation of astrology, and then towards what we now call as the humanistic presentation or series. So, in fact, Alan Leo wrote the book series called Astrology for All in 1903. And this captured the imagination of the Western world. And then he wrote Esoteric Astrology in 1913. So, which is interesting because Alice Bailey, who was also a theosophist, would later write the book Esoteric Astrology in the 1940s, which elaborated on a whole, esoteric astrological system of its own, complete with different levels of rulership. And anyway, I should do a video on that because I studied that for a long time. So later, Dane Rudyard, who was, sort of the other father of modern astrology, at least who really deepened the psychological and humanistic approach. In fact, the humanistic approach was sort of his term. He wrote in 1936 the book, The Astrology of Personality. This changed everything. This brought in depth psychology, Carl Jung, Jungian psychology, which is so associated and inextricable from modern astrology today. And Dane Rudyard was close friends with Alice Bailey. In fact, some of his books were published under her Lucis Publishing Company. He was, suffice it to say, an Alice Bailey student, but they later had a break because of the whole esoteric astrology thing. So we won't go into that whole thing. But anyway, what Alice Bailey presented was a whole spiritual cosmology that was erected on a lot of ancient philosophies and on the theosophical teaching. But she also claimed to have gotten a lot of her teachings from a Tibetan master that was communicating with her telepathically. Again, has to do with her whole book series, but another conversation for another time. So some interesting modern astrologers that we see now, the ones that came out of the 1960s, they were all reading Dane Rudyard and Alan Leo. I mean, Dane Rudyard was really the only stuff that they had to read at the time. So I'm talking astrologers like Liz Green, who was a hero of mine. You should read her Saturn book. It was one of my favorites when I was first getting into this around 22, 23. There's Richard Tarnas. There's, who did a lot about Pluto and the outer planets. There's Jeffrey Wolf Green and Stephen Forrest, who did evolutionary astrology. Alan Oken, who was an Alice Bailey student, passed away last year. Very sad. I started reading him when I was like 22. I'm 40 now, to give you a sense of all this stuff. So Alan Oken, who was an Alice Bailey student and wrote about esoteric astrology. He wrote the book Soul-Centered Astrology, which you all should read. Very interesting. Gives you a perspective. Because the actual Alice Bailey books are very, very dense. Do I have any right here? I think there. Oh, here we go. Here we go. Is it? Where's esoteric astrology? Here we go. This is esoteric astrology. All of her books look like this, and so we call them the blue books. Yeah, this is like a 500-page book. But, it's worth getting to know and understand because it'll give you a sense of the history and the lineage of all this stuff. So anyway, and we have ancient astrology coming back. So I've been most interested in ancient astrology for the past 4 to 5 years. And so, we had the resurgence coming out of the 1980s with astrologers like Robert Hand, Demetra George, and Robert Schmidt. There were ancient Greek texts that had tons of astrological information that hadn't been translated. So there was a project known as Project Hindsight that undertook the effort to translate a lot of this stuff. And this is where we get knowledge of some of these most amazing techniques that are very practical. Anyway, let's get into astrology itself before this, we're here at 25 minutes. Goodness gracious. So the main components of astrology are 4 things: signs, planets, aspects, and houses. We'll talk about what those things are in just a second. Well, signs. You know what signs are. Everyone talks about my sign. What's your sign? Right? Well, the tropical zodiac, as we talked about earlier, consists of 12 equal signs of 30 degrees. So The signs were considered the heavenly realm where the gods dwelt. So now the signs themselves are based on the unchanging rhythm of the solstices and equinoxes. And the signs primarily get their meanings from, number one, the planets that rule them, but number two, their place in the solar cycle. That is the alternation between light and dark over the course of a year. Now, from the perspective of the Northern Hemisphere, because that's where astrology came from, ancient Mesopotamia, at least Western astrology. So I have lots of friends down under in Oz and Old Zealand, and they don't flip the zodiac. Okay, it's a whole nother subject. We won't get into that. Whole nother subject. So the place in the solar cycle. Now the solar cycle is sort of emblematic, right, of the life of the sun god, or the maturation of consciousness, right, as the sun god passes from death to immortality. It's like cycles within cycles. The sun essentially defines the zodiac. So, in fact, I want to show you a little something. This was the chart of the United States over here. Where is my other guy? Here we go. So this guy is called the Thema Mundi, right? It's essentially the hypothetical chart for the birth of the cosmos. It's not possible, right? But we start here with the sun and the moon, right? And they're opposite Saturn here. Anyway, so the rulerships are defined by the sun and the moon, which we call the luminaries. They were placed at the two hottest and brightest months of the year, opposite Saturn, who was placed right at the two coldest and darkest months of the year, right? At the, oops, here's my cursor. Here we go. At the winter solstice, which is Capricorn, isn't it? So Saturn was the furthest visible object. So he became the Lord of Darkness, right? And he was sort of pitted against the sun and the moon as, in their struggle here. And you'll notice that the other planets were sort of filled in, right, with the other signs in order of their speed and distance. So anyway, so you can see this symbolism here of light and dark, right? I mean, just think about it really quick. We'll take Libra as an example. What's Libra? Well, it's the place of equal night and equal day, isn't it? It's where neither darkness nor light dominate. I mean, both of the equinoxes are. But Libra is that time of year where the light is starting to wane. In fact, it starts to wane immediately after the summer solstice, doesn't it? So Libra is that place where the sun descends into the next phase in Scorpio, where darkness dominates light. The days get longer, and therefore darkness wins. And you can see the Christ myth sort of repeated in all this, right? That's where Scorpio gets a lot of its meaning, from the fact that the darkness is starting to win over the light. Let's think about the Christ myth for a second, which is sort of like symbolic of the solar deity in general. So in Aries, which is the spring equinox, it's where neither light nor dark dominate again, but it's waxing. That's the point of the year when the light is starting to wax again. So in Pisces, coming through that, the nights are still longer than the days, but the light is growing, you see? So in Aries, it's sort of like the birth, isn't it? And we also have this idea of resurrection that happens around Easter. So you can see the symbol here. And then we have the summer solstice, Cancer, where the light is the brightest. This is sort of like Christ in his ministry, so to speak. And then we get to Libra again, right? So we see that descent. But anyway, that's just to illustrate a little bit about how the cycle of light and dark gives meaning to the astrological signs, to the zodiac itself. So anyway, each of the signs rules particular people, places, things, and qualities. And you'll see, let's look at the glyphs of the signs really quick. Can you see them here? So you see Aries here at the top, and then Taurus, Gemini, and then we have Cancer, Leo, Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces. Okay? So remember, we're trying to make this as brief as possible. So now the planets. So traditional astrology used the 7 traditional planets, which is the Sun, the Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And here we got the glyphs. So here's the Sun, here's the Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. So the luminaries were considered the lights, right? The Sun is the giver of light. The Moon was considered to be counterfeit light. She reflects the light of the Sun. She was the reflective light. Now the Sun rules the day and the Moon governs the night. So the Sun defines a year by his passage through the Zodiac and the interchange, the alternation between light and dark through the solstices and equinoxes. Whereas the Moon defines a month. So, in fact, it takes about, 27.3 days for the Moon to complete a revolution around the Earth. And the Moon phases mean things. And you may know the Moon phases are a cycle, which is called a synodic cycle between the Moon and the Sun. And so it has to do with the relationship between the Sun and the Moon and the Earth, right? That gives rise to these moon phases. Now, some planets were considered good and some were considered bad. That's benefic is good and malefic is bad. So I know a lot of people don't like the term malefic and benefic these days. You know, especially the new agey people, they're like, everything's okay. It's all a lesson. It's all good from the angle of the soul. Sure, cool, okay. But how does it feel when you get slapped in the face, right? I mean, some of us are into that sort of thing, you know, but you feel me, right? So the two benefics were Jupiter and Venus, right? Jupiter is the primary benefic, right? The bigger benefic, and Venus is sort of the lesser benefic. The malefics, or the bad guys, were Mars and Saturn, whereas Mars is the lesser malefic and Saturn is the greater malefic, right? Mercury was sort of neutral, you know, he could go both ways. So now the nature of the malefics and the benefics changed based on whether you were born at night or in the day. We won't go into all, I mean, Jupiter's better if you were born during the day. Venus is better if you were born during the night. Saturn is really bad if you were born during the night. And Mars is really bad if you were born during the day. So, but leave it like that. Again, Mercury goes both ways. Excuse me. Oh, and we talked about the glyphs of the planets already. So astrology is geocentric, meaning it takes the Earth as the center. So therefore, the apparent motion of the planets becomes the subject of interpretation. Let's pull back up. Let's pull back up our other guy here. Oops, wrong one. Wrong one. Oops. Here we go. Now, this is the chart of the United States using that, you know, that famous date of July 4th, 1776. So I wanted to use this as a quick illustration of all these fun little things here, right? Like I said, the apparent motion of the planets becomes the subject of interpretation. So examples of this are planetary speed and then retrograde, right? Retrogradation. We also have things like eclipses, yes? We have the synodic cycles, like we talked about with the lunar solar cycle, the moon phases. But every planet has synodic cycles with the sun, right? It from conjunction to conjunction. We won't go into all that, but those have meanings too. Or the relationships between planets, like conjunctions, etc. So planets were considered gods. A lot of these go back to ancient Mesopotamia. For example, Venus, right? She traces back to the Akkadian Ishtar or the Sumerian Inanna. In fact, I do devotion to Inanna. She's kind of my mama. In fact, she was the goddess of love and war, but we won't go into all that. The Indian astrologers called the planets grahas or grabbers, which I think is very important to note because it's a reference to fate. It was sort of like the planets grabbed you, and influenced you or influenced what you did in a way. And there was the idea, I believe it was Democritus who said it, but I can't remember. A Greek philosopher said that the gods lived our lives for us, or in a way lived their lives through us. You see? It was like the planets or the gods. They took hold of your situation. So anyway, it sort of implies this struggle between fate and free will, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So, but each planet, just like the signs, embodies particular qualities and rules particular people, places, things, right? So, for example, the moon is often associated with the mother, yeah? The sun with the father, or Saturn with the father sometimes for people born at night. Anyway, you see what I'm talking about here. So, so now the outer planets, right? The outer planets. Well, Saturn was the furthest visible object, wasn't he? But then we had Uranus discovered in 1781, Neptune discovered in 1846, and Pluto discovered in 1930. So what's interesting about Uranus being discovered is it was during the time of revolutions. I mean, the American Revolution had been going on, and the French Revolution was about to erupt. So, and Uranus is now associated with revolutions, with rebellions, and with unexpected events. So Neptune was surprisingly discovered when the Mormon migration was happening. And it was actually during a slew of other religious movements taking hold and proliferating at the time. And then Pluto. Now, what's interesting is Neptune is also associated with religion, with idealism, with fantasy, and intoxication. Pluto was discovered in 1930, which is during the beginnings of depth psychology. And Pluto does have to do with depth and the underworld and drawing things up from the depths. We're not going into the meanings of all the planets, though. We're just illustrating, I don't use the outer planets as rulers of anything, but they are used as rulers by modern astrologers. And then the planets also have relationships between themselves called aspects. Now, what is an aspect? Aspects are essentially angles between two planets. The word aspect comes from the Latin aspicere. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, which meant in Latin to look or behold. The planets were said to be exchanging glances with each other, right? Some could be happy and some could be angry glances. So once again, this is sort of based on the thema mundi as well, the aspects. And I want to show you the aspect here. So you can see here, aspects here between each of these planets and signs. So, just like the planets were benefic and malefic, the aspects were also benefic and malefic as well. And you'll see a lot of them, you'll see them illustrated, the malefic aspects in red, oftentimes in charts, and the benefic aspects illustrated in blue. So let's start off here with the trines. The trines were the most benefic aspect. They were considered to be in the nature of Jupiter because you can see each of the luminaries is configured to them in this Thema Mundi hypothetical chart for the beginning of the universe with a hot pocket. Mini-me, we do not eat our kitties. Sorry. Anyway. So you see, they were in the nature of Jupiter because they were configured here to each of the luminaries in that way. It's the best aspect. And if you draw a trine, which is 120 degrees around the zodiac, you'll create a triangle, an equilateral triangle. Now, sextiles were the next best aspect. They are 60 degrees here. You see the glyph where a trine is a triangle. The sextile is like the 6 here, 6 lines. They were the second best, like I said, and in the nature of Venus, because you can see each of the luminaries is then configured to Venus by a sextile. And then the squares were the second worst aspect, said to be in the nature of Mars, because you can see they're configured by a square here to each of the luminaries. And then oppositions were the worst aspect because they're opposite the luminaries, right? And they're said to be in the nature of Saturn, who is the most malefic planet. Now, these are just the traditional aspects. They're the only ones I use. There are loads and loads of minor aspects, just like ad nauseum. So when you start putting all those things into a chart, it looks like cat's cradle, okay? And it's like information overload. I get plenty of information with just these traditional aspects. So I tell everyone just start with those because people go off into crazy land with all this nonsense. And I suggest that you start with the basics and work up. And you may find that simplicity is beautiful, like I sure did. Now, let's talk about houses. So if the zodiac is the heavenly realm, like we mentioned earlier, then houses are where the heavenly realm touches our terrestrial experience. First of all, let me say for you people out there that houses do not equal signs, and signs do not equal houses. Houses don't get their meanings from the signs. They get their meanings from, the rising and setting of objects over the course of a day. Just as the signs get their meanings from the journey of the sun through the zodiac over the course of a year. We'll talk about that in just a second. Let me pull up my other fun picture here. This is another fun picture. Yay! I made these pictures so I wouldn't get in trouble. So anyway, like I said, the rising and setting of objects over the course of a day. So check it. Think of it like this. In the east, at dawn, the sun rose in the east. This became the place of rising, which eventually became the first house, you see? And objects then rose to their highest point in the sky, where the sun was the brightest at its meridian or zenith. This became the 10th house, right? And then objects or the sun began to set in the west at the end of the day or at the close of the day. And this became the place of setting or the 7th house opposite the first. And then at midnight, or, this is called the midnight spot, the deepest and darkest place in your chart. And this is where objects were most hidden, right? And it became the 4th house. So these were the angular houses. They became known as angles or pivots. They were the most powerful places in your chart. The rest of the houses, right? They derived their meanings from their relationships to the angles, as well as other things that we won't go into right now. But let's just suffice it to say a lot of the relationships to the angles. Now, the chart itself is a map of the horizon when you were born. You see? So, like, here's the east and the west, the high point in the sky. Excuse me. Let's pull up the chart of the US again. So, like I said, it's a map of the horizon as you were born. Yeah? You see the ascendant, descendant axis here. That was the horizon. So this is where objects were rising up above as you were born. Well, as the United States was born. It doesn't have any objects rising, but it does have some culminating, right? You could see that Uranus had just set, right? And Mars was just setting. So you could see that objects over the course of a day, this is very important. There's two types of motion. There's primary motion and secondary or transit motion. Primary motion or diurnal motion is the rising and setting of objects from east to west over the course of a day. And then, right, you can see how these objects move, right, over the course of a day, clockwise. Whereas transit motion or secondary motion, right, goes through the zodiac, counterclockwise. Important to recognize because primary motion is where houses get their meaning. So, but we're not going to go into the details of that. Houses themselves represent, again, people, places, and things. For example, the fourth house is the father, oftentimes. We think of the first house as you. The fourth house is more than that, but, that's a specific person associated with it. Seventh house, for example, like partners or whatever. So, now how about house systems? Oh, wait, hold on. Sorry. Empty houses. You can see the United States here has an empty fifth house. So people always ask me, what if I have empty houses? I say, empty houses? No problem. Look to the ruler of that house. So, for example, this empty fifth house of the US is ruled by Mars, who rules Aries. And then Mars is in Gemini there in the seventh house. So and we can get all sorts of meanings from that placement, but we're not going to go into that. So, well, let's talk about house systems. Well, I use whole sign houses, as you can see in this chart here. Whole sign houses means that each house, 1 through 12, begins and ends with that entire sign, beginning with the rising sign. So you can see in the case of the United States, the rising sign is Sagittarius. So the whole sign of Sagittarius constitutes the first house. That means even if your ascendant were at 29 degrees Sagittarius, in whole sign houses, Sagittarius would still be the first house. For those of you who get what I'm saying, you'll understand. For those of you who are still new to all this, don't worry, just hang on with us, okay? Now, there are also what are called quadrant houses. We're not going to talk about what that means, but let's suffice it to say that Placidus is the most famous. And you'll often see this as the default house system on, say, astro.com or any number of the other astrological websites or apps. So, now I'm suggesting that everyone try whole sign houses and play with it and see how you like it. People just sort of default to Placidus because that's what apps do. So there are plenty of other systems than those, but we're not going to talk about those. Well, so what do all these things mean here in the chart? Let's talk a little bit about, we already talked about the planets, right? And we talked about the signs, the glyphs, but we didn't talk about some of these other interesting things. So now, see this AS here? That's the ascendant or the degree of the rising sign. You'll often see opposite DC for descendant. And so these two constitute the horizon as you were born. So the first house here, the rising sign, has to do with you and mind, body, and spirit. A lot of ancient astrologers called it the soul. Now, then you'll see this MC up here. That stands for medium coeli, or what we call the midheaven. Medium coeli means middle of the sky, or the meridian, the highest point, or the zenith. The highest point in the sky when you were born. So, and this was known as recognition or renown, right? Your life direction or your praxis, what people know you for. And then we were just talking about the descendant opposite the ascendant, which opposite you had to do with other people, partners and partnerships, often marriages or business dealings, where things set in the West. And then the IC down here opposite the MC stood for Imam Coeli, or the bottom of the sky. It was the deepest, darkest point and came to represent your origins, or became associated with the fourth house, you see. So, and then here we have the lunar nodes. This is the north node, and it's essentially where the moon's orbit intersects the Earth's orbit around the sun, or what we call the ecliptic, which appears to us as the path of the sun across the sky. But what we know in reality is the Earth orbiting the sun, right? And then the sun rotating on its axis gives us the apparent motion of the rising and setting. Now, the lunar nodes were where eclipses took place, because that intersection between the sun's orbit and the moon's orbit created a place of alignment. So if you had a new moon or a full moon that was close to the lunar nodes, or that place of alignment, then you would have an eclipse, either a lunar eclipse if it's a full moon, or a solar eclipse if it's a new moon. Now, what are some other things here? Oh, Mercury is retrograde here. You can tell because it's in red, right? Some other apps will put a little RX next to it. So retrograde is when planets appear to move backwards, because they are orbiting the sun just like us, but at different speeds. So as an inner planet, or what we call an inferior planet, like, Mercury or Venus, those are the two inferior planets, ones that are faster, closer to the sun than Earth. As they approach the Earth, they will appear to slow down and move backwards as they pass, and then appear to move forwards again as they finish passing. For the outer or superior planets, the ones that are further from the sun than Earth, that's Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and then the other outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto. As the Earth speeds up and as the Earth approaches them to overtake them, then they appear to slow down and move backwards. So that's what we mean by planetary speed. And that also is something that we interpret in astrology. You see, it's very important, all these things. Now, there are lots of different types of Western astrology. There's mundane astrology, which is the study of, like I said, big events we talked about earlier. A king dying, or things that have to do with nations or weather or whatever. There's natal astrology, which has to do with you and your particular birth chart. There's horary astrology, which is how we ask specific questions. It's sort of like, doing a tarot reading almost. There's relationship astrology, which I love to do. It has to do with, looking at the charts of two people and how they interact. There's esoteric astrology, which is the astrology of the soul. And there's evolutionary astrology, which is sort of derivative of those, right? So now let's talk a little bit about how astrology works and my philosophy of astrology. Well, first of all, like I indicated earlier, it's correlative, not causal. The planets are not causing you to do anything. This is about interrelation and interconnection. You remember that diviner's manual we talked about earlier? Earth and sky are interconnected. In fact, there's no evidence that the planets are exerting any discernible influence on us. People always bring up the moon as an example, like, well, the moon, controls the tides and all this sort of thing. But, the lunar qualities that we ascribe to her are not intrinsic to her. Those are things, right, that we use as symbols. right? We're projecting those qualities on her. So I keep calling her she, right? We're seeing her as embodying these sorts of things, but there's still the actual rock. That's the moon. So astrology is symbolic. It's not scientific. Now, there have been efforts ever since the time of Ptolemy in Egypt, right, around the 1st century, to make it a science or scientific. But it's divination. It's not science. Even Dane Rudyard, the modern astrologer, said that if we did find out someday that the planets are directly exerting influence on our psychology, it wouldn't change the fact that astrology is an interpretive system of correlation, not causation. I always say Mars didn't make you an asshole, psychology did. Mars just announced it. So my personal philosophy here on why astrology works and why any divination works is that we live in an interdependent and relativistic universe, right? That means that everything depends on everything else for its existence, and everything is analogical to everything else. I mean, you could use anything for divination or read anything. You could read your own vomit or your feces if you were so inclined. I mean, I prefer astrology because we have like 4,000 years of data to draw on, but you see what I'm saying. Astrology is a tool for self-development. I mean, we can look at money and sex. I love those two things just as much as anyone. But we can use it. We can use it on our spiritual journey. For example, ancient philosophies, many of which were the basis for ancient astrology, like Platonism and Hermeticism, espouse the view that we are fragments, or the soul is fragment of the divine, and that the great work is progressively finding our way back to our source in reuniting or re-identifying with it. Now, I mean, some of these traditions even said this was progressive over many, many lives. And you'll see reincarnation sort of echoed through a lot of these philosophies. Over time, we become more impersonal, less attached to our identifications or our conditioning. Carl Jung said that which remains unconscious manifests outside as fate. He also coined the phrase shadow work. What's a shadow do? It hides something. What do you do when you want to see it? You shine a light on it. What's the light here? It's the light of attention. We are making the unconscious conscious. Plato said to become a spectator of time is a cure for meanness of soul. We're learning to become observers of our own lives. And that's where we get a conscious choice. Attention is like the first place we experience the will. It's where we have to make a conscious choice. And it's a superpower we can work at and exercise over time. And we repeat the same painful patterns over and over again until we see them quite clearly, right? We can't change our patterns because suppressing thoughts or feelings will just make us sick. We can learn to look, right? And shine the light of attention. 99% of life is fated. It just happens to us. I made that number up, but you feel me? The 1% that matters is the ability to direct our attention, because that is where we get conscious choice. And that's where we do get to make a decision. We see through a glass darkly, as St. Paul said. That means through layers and layers of identification and conditioning. I'm Frankie, I'm a trans girl, I'm an astrologer. These things, they're conditions. It's not me. These things will pass away eventually. We see through a series of these identifications because we're learning bit by bit to clear the dust off the glass, off the screen, and see things more and more as they are. And as we see our own bullshit, it makes us way more forgiving of other people's. You see? In fact, that's how we learn compassion. The only thing you know for sure is that you are here. What does that mean? That means you're the door to your own source. You are the door to your source. That means your own sense of consciousness of being you. That's what we're making the effort here to understand through astrology. We become more impersonal, and life can't shake us so much because life grabs us by our identifications and shakes us back and forth. So you see, the whole idea of astrology is not about changing our fate, but it's learning to face whatever comes. I'm going to leave you all here with a quote by Vedius Valens, the 1st or 2nd century astrologer. He said, "For God in his desire that man should foreknow the future, brought this science into the world, a science through which anyone can know his fate, in order to bear the good with great contentment, and the bad with great steadfastness." Vedius Valens, Anthologies, Book 1. Let's learn together to face whatever comes. Life sucks. Much of it sucks. Being happy seems absurd. Why should we be happy? But life is punctuated with joy, because the underlying philosophical basis of all this is that we are always on the verge of a new discovery. We are always on the precipice of greater understanding. And as Ramana Maharshi said, if we are seeking God with all our hearts, earnestly, then we can be rest assured that God is seeking us with even more fervence. So, once again, like the video, subscribe to my channel, share with your friends. I do wonderful readings. Check out all my information in the description below. And I love you so much. Have a wonderful whatever you're having. And now we're going to end transmission.